Okay, let's dive into one of Ireland's most infamous murder cases. It's a story that kicks off with a frantic call in the dead of night. And while it just unravels from there into this incredible web of greed, deception, and a really cold, calculated murder. So, this was the story Catherine Nevin told police. This was her account of the night her husband, Tom, was murdered at their pub, Jack White's Inn. A terrifying home invasion, right? A terrified wife, a tragic death. But that story, it started falling apart almost right away. All right, so let's start with the official story. This is the version of events that Catherine Nevin gave to the police. This is the narrative she really hoped everyone was going to believe. At first glance, it seems pretty straightforward. A tragic robbery that went horribly wrong at a pub out in the middle of nowhere. A well-liked publican, killed for the weekend's cash. But from the moment the Irish police, the Gardaí, showed up, they had some serious questions. Yeah, right from the get-go, investigators started noticing things that just didn't add up. The physical evidence at the crime scene just wasn't lining up with Catherine's very dramatic story. So you've got her story on one side, and then the actual evidence on the other, and they just didn't match. Police were thinking, okay, how does an attacker get in without breaking a window or a door? And why on earth would the alarm system be turned off in a business holding that much cash? And this is where things get really weird. The timeline was a huge problem for the police. The pathologist figured Tom was probably killed around 2 in the morning. But Catherine doesn't hit the alarm until 2.5 hours later. For investigators, that gap was just this massive black hole where the official story completely fell apart. What happened in all that time? And then there's this, which is just baffling. Police found a panic alarm, totally working, sitting right there on her bedroom windowsill. So why would she claim to have struggled to get free and made her way all the way to the front door instead of just using the alarm right next to her? The logic just makes no sense. So as the police dug deeper, this whole robbery gone wrong theory started to fade, and a much darker picture of their marriage began to emerge. The focus wasn't on some random attacker anymore. It was turning directly onto Catherine herself. Yeah, the people who worked there, they told a completely different story. They described a marriage that was, well, anything but loving. They said it was full of constant fighting, Catherine was having multiple affairs, and Tom actually seemed to be afraid of his wife. Some had even seen Tom with bandages after their arguments. And what was the motive? Well, you can probably guess. With Tom out of the picture, Catherine got everything. Full control of the pub, all their properties, and a very hefty inheritance. The prosecution would later argue it was a pretty simple and chilling mix of hatred and pure greed. But here's the kicker. The prosecution's case hinged on something truly shocking. They believed this wasn't some sudden crime of passion. No, this was a plot years in the making. And they had the testimony of 3 different men from Catherine's past to prove it. This is where the whole thing just goes to another level. Get this. Years before the murder, between 1989 and 1990, she had apparently tried to hire not 1, not 2, but 3 separate men to kill her husband. And her plan was always the same. She wanted it to look like a robbery gone wrong. For the prosecution, this was the smoking gun. This wasn't a sudden idea. It was proof of a cold-blooded plan she'd been trying to execute for years. So, fast forward to the year 2000, and Catherine Nevin is on trial. The whole country was absolutely glued to this case. The press even gave it a name, the Black Widow trial. The prosecution's argument was pretty straightforward. They said this was a contract killing, plain and simple. Catherine let the killer into the pub, waited for her husband to be murdered, and then used all that stolen cash from the weekend, that's 16,000 pounds, as the payoff for the hitman. And then, in a really bold move, Catherine gets on the stand herself. And she just denies everything, point blank. She denied the affairs, denied trying to hire anyone, and of course, denied any part in his murder. She even tried to throw out this theory that Tom's supposed IRA connections got him killed, which the prosecution basically called a desperate attempt to confuse the jury. Okay, so after all the drama, all the testimony, and the trial actually had to be restarted at one point with a whole new jury, it was finally time for a decision. And you can imagine, the entire nation was waiting. This was a tough one, right? No murder weapon, no confession, just a ton of circumstantial evidence. It all boiled down to who the jury believed. The deliberation took 5 full days, which was a record back then. And the verdict came back guilty. guilty of murder and guilty on all 3 counts of trying to hire those men to kill her husband years before. So she was sentenced to life. She spent the next 17 years in prison, fighting the conviction the whole time, losing every appeal. Eventually, she was diagnosed with terminal cancer and released on compassionate grounds. And through all of it, right up until her death in 2018, Catherine Nevin insisted she was innocent. And that leaves us with the one big unanswered question that still hangs over this case. The police had a pretty good idea who did it, a known criminal, but they never had enough to charge anyone with the murder itself. So the person who actually pulled the trigger was never brought to justice, leaving this final, haunting question mark on one of Ireland's most sensational cases.